The whip cracked through the Kansas air like thunder before lightning, and 16-year-old Lydia Grace didn't even flinch anymore. She'd learned not to. In the Cole farmhouse, tears were just another excuse for Harriet to strike harder. But on this dust-choked evening in 1878, everything was about to change because a stranger was watching. And some men, when they see evil wearing a respectable dress, decide they've stayed silent long enough. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Lydia's story travels. The cup shattered before Lydia even realized it had slipped from her fingers. She stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, watching the pieces scatter across the wooden floor like stars falling from a dying sky. The delicate porcelain one of Mrs. Harriet Cole's prized pieces from her wedding set now lay in ruins at Lydia's feet, reflecting the late afternoon sun that slanted through the dusty windows. For one heartbeat, 2, 3, there was only silence. Then Harriet's chair scraped against the floor in the dining room. Lydia's hands began to tremble. She knew that sound the way a horse knows the rattle of a snake. Her eyes darted to the back door 15 feet away, maybe 20. She could run. The thought flashed through her mind like summer lightning, bright and brief, and ultimately useless. Where would she go? The nearest neighbor was 3 miles east, and they'd just send her right back. They always did. Lydia Grace. Harriet's voice was cold and precise, each syllable dropping like stones into a well. The widow appeared in the doorway, her black dress immaculate despite the day's work, her graying hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent mask of disapproval. She was a handsome woman still, at 43, with the kind of austere beauty that made people in town call her dignified, respectable. Lydia knew better. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Cole." Lydia whispered, her voice barely audible. "It slipped. I didn't mean—" "You never mean to." Harriet's pale blue eyes swept over the broken china, then rose to fix on Lydia with the cold assessment of a butcher eyeing meat. "You never mean to burn the bread. You never mean to oversleep. You never mean to track mud across my clean floors, or forget to close the chicken coop, or any of the 1,000 other failures that make up your worthless existence." The words landed like slaps, but Lydia had learned to let them wash over her. Words couldn't leave scars you could see. "Go to the barn," Harriet said quietly. "You know what happens when you break things that don't belong to you." Lydia's stomach clenched. "Please, Mrs. Cole, I'll work extra. I'll skip supper. The barn. Now." There was no arguing with that tone. Lydia had tried once 2 years ago when she'd first come to live here after her parents died of fever. She'd been 14 then, still foolish enough to believe that explanations mattered, that fairness existed, that someone might listen. The scars on her back had taught her otherwise. She walked past Harriet on legs that felt disconnected from her body, out through the kitchen across the dusty yard, where chickens pecked at nothing, toward the weathered barn that loomed against the darkening sky like a gallows. The Kansas wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry grass and coming rain. Storm clouds were building to the west, purple and heavy. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of hay and horse sweat. Harriet's mare, Delilah, nickered softly from her stall, the only creature on this farm that ever greeted Lydia with something other than indifference or contempt. Lydia paused to stroke the horse's nose, drawing what comfort she could from the animal's warm breath against her palm. "Don't keep me waiting." Harriet stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light, the leather strap already in her hand. Not a horse whip that would be too obvious, might leave marks someone could see. This was thinner, more precise. A punishment device, nothing more. Lydia moved to the center of the barn, to the post where she'd stood so many times before. She knew the routine by heart. Remove her shawl, turn her back, place her palms flat against the rough wood. Wait. "How many pieces?" Harriet asked. Lydia's throat tightened. "7, ma'am. 7 pieces of my mother's china, the only things I have left of her." Harriet's voice cracked slightly, and for just a moment Lydia heard the grief beneath the anger, but she'd learned not to trust those moments. Harriet's grief always transformed into rage, and Lydia was always the vessel meant to contain it. 7 pieces, Harriet repeated. That seems a fair number, don't you think? Lydia closed her eyes. Yes, ma'am. The first strike came without warning, a line of fire across her shoulder blades. Lydia bit down on her lip hard enough to taste copper. She would not scream. Screaming only made it last longer. 2, 3, 4, each strike precisely placed, never overlapping. Harriet was methodical in her cruelty, careful never to break the skin, never to leave marks that couldn't be hidden beneath a high-collared dress. This was discipline, she would say, if anyone asked. This was what happened when you spared the rod and spoiled the child. 5, 6. Lydia's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. In her mind she went somewhere else, to the memory of her mother's laugh, to the feel of her father's hand ruffling her hair, to the before times when she'd been loved simply for existing, when mistakes meant gentle corrections and try again tomorrow. The 7th strike never came. Instead, a man's voice cut through the barn like a blade. What in God's name are you doing? Lydia's eyes snapped open. In the doorway stood a man she'd never seen before, tall and weather-worn, maybe 40, with the kind of face that had seen too much sun and not enough sleep. He wore dusty traveling clothes and a wide-brimmed hat, and he was staring at Harriet with an expression of pure horror. Harriet lowered the strap slowly, her composure returning like ice forming over water. You're trespassing on private property, sir. I suggest you leave before I send for the sheriff. I'm Reverend Samuel Pierce, passing through on my way to Salina. The man's voice shook with barely controlled anger. I stopped to water my horse at your creek and heard... He broke off, his eyes finding Lydia taking in her trembling form, her exposed back, the red welts already rising. Dear Lord, how old are you, child? Lydia couldn't answer. Her voice had fled somewhere deep inside her chest. She's 16, Harriet said crisply, and under my legal guardianship. How I choose to discipline her is no concern of yours, Reverend. Discipline. The preacher's face flushed red. That's not discipline, Mrs. Cole. Mrs. Harriet Cole. She drew herself up to her full height, and her voice took on the tone she used in town, the one that reminded everyone she was the daughter of Judge Whitmore, that her late husband had owned half the land between here and Abilene. My ward is prone to carelessness and disobedience. The good book tells us that those who spare the rod hate their children. I am merely ensuring she learns right from wrong. The good book also says to discipline in love, not in rage. Reverend Pierce took a step forward, and what I saw through that door wasn't love, Mrs. Cole. It was vengeance. For a moment, something flickered across Harriet's face, surprise, perhaps, or fear. Few people in Johnson County spoke to her that way, but the moment passed and her expression hardened into cold disdain. You may water your horse and be on your way, Reverend. What happens in my home is between me, this girl, and the Lord. Then I'll be speaking to the Lord about it tonight, Pierce said quietly, and to anyone else who'll listen. He held Harriet's gaze for a long moment before turning to Lydia. Child, if you need help, if you need somewhere to go. She doesn't, Harriet interrupted. Lydia, go to the house, now. Lydia grabbed her shawl with shaking hands and fled, not daring to look at either of them. As she ran across the yard, she heard the preacher's voice one more time. God sees everything, Mrs. Cole, everything. That night, Lydia lay on her narrow bed in the attic room, staring at the ceiling where moonlight painted silver patterns through the gaps in the roof. Her back throbbed with each heartbeat, a steady reminder of her failure, but beneath the pain something else stirred, a dangerous, fragile thing she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Someone had seen. Someone had spoken up. It might not matter, probably wouldn't matter, but for the first time in 2 years, Lydia wasn't completely alone in her suffering. She rolled onto her side, careful not to press against the welts, and whispered into the darkness, Please, God, I don't know if you're listening. I don't know if you care about girls like me, but if you do, if you could, I just want to be free. I want to belong somewhere. I want someone to see me as more than broken things and mistakes. Please." The words dissolved into tears she'd been holding back all evening. She cried silently, her face pressed into her thin pillow, until exhaustion finally dragged her down into restless sleep. Downstairs, Harriet sat in her dead husband's chair, staring at the 7 pieces of broken china she'd arranged on the table before her. In the lamplight, they looked like bones. She should throw them away. They were useless now, couldn't be repaired. But she couldn't bring herself to do it, just like she couldn't bring herself to let go of her daughter's room, still perfect and untouched after 8 years. Just like she couldn't stop seeing Elizabeth's face in every young girl she passed on the street. Elizabeth, her real daughter, dead at 8, from scarlet fever, buried beneath the cottonwood tree on the hill. Harriet picked up one shard of china, running her finger along the sharp edge until a thin line of blood appeared. The pain was clarifying, real. She'd taken Lydia in because the pastor had said it was Christian charity, because people expected it of the grieving widow, because somewhere in her shattered heart she'd thought maybe, just maybe, she could shape this orphan girl into what Elizabeth might have become. But Lydia was nothing like Elizabeth. She was clumsy where Elizabeth had been graceful, quiet where Elizabeth had been bright, alive where Elizabeth was dead, and Harriet hated her for all of it. The hatred was a living thing inside her chest, black and twisted and growing. She knew it was wrong. She knew what the preacher would say, what God would say, but knowing didn't stop the rage that flooded through her every time Lydia breathed, every time she moved, every time she existed in the space that should have belonged to someone else. "I'm making her strong," Harriet whispered to the empty room. "The world is cruel. I'm teaching her to survive it." But even as she said the words, she knew they were lies. She wasn't teaching Lydia anything except how to endure pain. And somewhere deep down in a part of herself she refused to examine, Harriet knew she was becoming the very cruelty she claimed to be preparing the girl for. She swept the china pieces into her apron and carried them to the trash bin outside. The night was cool and clear, full of stars that seemed to mock her with their indifferent beauty. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, lonely and searching. Harriet dumped the broken pieces and stood there in the darkness, listening to her own ragged breathing. Tomorrow she would be better. Tomorrow she would be kinder. Tomorrow she would remember that Lydia was just a child who'd lost everything just like she had. But tomorrow always came with the same rage, the same bitterness, the same desperate need to hurt something because she hurt so badly herself. Inside the house, the clock struck midnight, each chime echoing through empty rooms where love had died and only its ghost remained. 3 days later, on Sunday morning, the church in town was packed. Reverend Pierce stood in the pulpit of the small clapboard building, his voice carrying over the congregation like thunder. He'd been invited to give a guest sermon while the regular pastor was visiting family in Topeka, and he'd chosen his text carefully, Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats. "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." He read, his eyes sweeping across the upturned faces. The Lord doesn't ask us if we went to church every Sunday. He doesn't ask if we said our prayers or sang our hymns. He asks, did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? Did you visit the imprisoned? His voice dropped lower, more intense. Did you protect the vulnerable? Did you speak up for those who have no voice? Or did you look away because it was easier, because it wasn't your business, because the person doing the harm wore nice clothes and owned property and attended church just like you? A ripple went through the congregation. People shifted in their pews. Harriet, sitting in her usual spot in the third row, sat perfectly still, her face a mask. "I stopped at a farm 3 days ago," Pierce continued, "and I saw something that has haunted me every moment since. I saw a child entrusted to an adult's care being beaten like an animal, And when I objected, I was told it was discipline, that it was none of my concern, that it was a private matter between that household and God. More shifting. A few whispered conversations quickly hushed. But friends, there is no such thing as private sin when it harms the innocent. When a child cries out in pain, it echoes all the way to heaven. And God keeps a record of who heard that cry and chose to do nothing. After the service, people gathered outside in tight knots, voices low and urgent. Everyone knew who Pierce had been talking about, the Widow Cole, the girl she'd taken in. Some had suspected. A few had seen glimpses, Lydia's flinch, when someone moved too quickly, the way she kept her eyes down the long sleeves even in summer heat. But what could they do? Harriet Cole was wealthy, influential. Her father had been a judge. Her late husband had helped build half the town. You didn't accuse people like that without proof, without being absolutely certain. And besides, people reasoned, wasn't it better that the girl had a home at all? She'd been heading for the poorhouse when Harriet took her in. At least now she had food, shelter, clothes. Wasn't that better than nothing? Sheriff Tom Miller stood apart from the groups, his weathered face troubled. He'd known Harriet since she was a girl, had served under her husband in the war. She'd always been hard but fair, strict but not cruel. But he'd also noticed things over the past 2 years. The way Lydia never came to town unless absolutely necessary. The careful way she moved like someone expecting to be struck. The haunted look in her eyes that reminded him of soldiers who'd seen too much combat. He'd told himself it was grief the girl had lost her parents after all, that she was just quiet by nature, that Harriet, for all her sternness, would never truly harm someone in her care. Now he wondered if he'd been lying to himself because the truth was too uncomfortable to face. As the crowd dispersed, one man remained standing beneath the cottonwood tree at the edge of the church property, watching everything with dark, thoughtful eyes. Jonas Hale hadn't been to church in 3 years, not since they'd buried his wife Sarah here beneath the prairie grass. He'd only come today because he'd heard there was a visiting preacher, and something about the way old Mrs. Henderson had mentioned it made him curious. Now he understood why. He'd seen Harriet Cole around town, always perfectly dressed, always perfectly composed. He'd heard people speak of her with respect, sometimes with pity for her losses. He'd never given her much thought, one way or another, but he recognized the cold precision in Pierce's description of that beating. He'd seen it before in his own childhood, before he'd run away at 14 to make his own way in the world. He knew the difference between a parent's discipline and an adult's rage, finding a convenient target. And he knew what it felt like to pray for escape in the darkness, wondering if anyone in the world could see you drowning right there in plain sight. Jonas pulled his hat lower and headed for his horse. He had a ranch to run cattle, to tend a life of careful solitude he'd built after Sarah's death. Getting involved in other people's problems wasn't part of that life. But as he rode out of town, Reverend Pierce's words followed him like smoke. God keeps a record of who heard that cry and chose to do nothing. Jonas had done nothing for too long, nothing but work his land and avoid anything that might make him feel again. Sarah's death had carved out his insides and left him hollow. It had been easier to stay that way, to fill the emptiness with routine and exhaustion instead of hope or purpose or connection. But maybe, he thought, as his horse carried him across the rolling prairie toward home, maybe hollow men could still be filled with something other than grief. Maybe they could be filled with purpose. The idea was dangerous. The idea was foolish. The idea took root anyway, growing in the space where his heart used to be. He didn't know yet what he would do. But as the sun climbed higher and the Kansas wind swept across the grasslands, Jonas Hale made a decision that would change everything. He would not look away. Not this time. Not ever again. Monday morning broke gray and heavy over the Cole farm, the kind of dawn that promised rain before nightfall. Lydia was in the chicken coop gathering eggs with careful hands when she heard the sound of hooves on the dirt road. Visitors were rare. Her heart clenched with the old familiar fear. Had the preacher told someone? Would there be questions? She didn't know how to answer without making things worse. She peered through the slats of the coop and saw a man on horseback approaching the house. Tall in the saddle, dark hat pulled low. Not the sheriff, not the preacher, someone else entirely. Harriet emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron, her face already arranged in the pleasant mask she wore for company. Lydia watched as the man dismounted, moving with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. "Mrs. Cole." His voice carried across the yard, deep and measured. "Name's Jonas Hale. I run a ranch about 15 miles west of here. Heard you might have some cattle for sale." Lydia's fingers tightened around the egg basket. They didn't have cattle for sale. Mr. Cole had sold off most of the herd before he died, and Harriet had let the rest go to neighbors over the years. Everyone in the county knew that. "I'm afraid you've been misinformed, Mr. Hale." Harriet's voice was cool, controlled. "We're not in the cattle business anymore." "That's so." Jonas pushed his hat back, and even from this distance Lydia could see him studying the farm with assessing eyes. "Shame. Man at the feed store said you had good stock once." "Once, yes. My husband kept a fine herd, but that was years ago." There was a pause. Jonas's gaze drifted across the yard, past the house toward the barn where Lydia stood frozen. She ducked back into the shadows, but not before their eyes met for just a second. Something in that brief connection made her breath catch. He'd been looking for her, she realized. This wasn't about cattle at all. "Well, I appreciate your time, ma'am." Jonas touched the brim of his hat. "Might I trouble you for some water for my horse before I head back? It's a long ride." Harriet hesitated, clearly wanting him gone, but hospitality demanded she agree. "There's a trough by the barn. Help yourself." Lydia's pulse quickened as Jonas led his horse across the yard, directly toward where she was hiding. She should go back to the house, keep her head down, avoid whatever this was. But her feet wouldn't move. Jonas stopped at the trough, letting his horse drink. He didn't look at the chicken coop, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. But when he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "The preacher told some folks in town what he saw. Wanted you to know that." Lydia's hands trembled. She pressed deeper into the shadows, saying nothing. "Also wanted you to know," Jonas continued, still not looking at her, "that if you ever need help, real help, there are people who'd offer it. No questions asked." He paused. "My ranch is 15 miles due west on the creek road. White house with a red barn. Anyone in town can give you directions." Before Lydia could process this, before she could even think of responding, Harriet's voice cut across the yard like a whip crack. "Lydia, those eggs won't gather themselves. And you, Mr. Hale, I believe your horse has had sufficient water." Jonas swung back into his saddle with unhurried ease. As he turned his horse toward the road, he finally glanced at the chicken coop, and his eyes found Lydia's one more time. There was something in his expression, not pity exactly, but recognition, the look of someone who'd known darkness and survived it. Then he was gone, riding back down the dusty road as the first drops of rain began to fall. Lydia stood there, clutching her basket of eggs, feeling the ghost of possibility settle over her like a shawl. 15 miles due west, White House, red barn. She committed it to memory the way a drowning person memorizes the location of shore, knowing that just because you could see salvation didn't mean you could reach it. The rain came harder, and she ran for the house. The storm that had threatened all morning arrived in full force by evening, turning the sky black and the wind into a living thing that clawed at the windows and tore at the roof. Lydia worked through supper preparations while Harriet sat in the parlor with her needlework, both of them pretending the visit from Jonas Hale had never happened. But Lydia couldn't stop thinking about it. Why had he come? What had the preacher told people? And most dangerously, what if there really was a way out? She pushed the thoughts down as she served Harriet's meal. Chicken and potatoes bread she'd baked that morning that had turned out better than usual. For once, she'd done something right. "The bread is acceptable," Harriet said after the first bite. It was the closest thing to praise Lydia had heard in months. "Thank you, ma'am." Thunder cracked overhead so loud it rattled the dishes. Through the window, lightning illuminated the yard in stark white flashes, turning everything into a landscape of shadows and harsh light. "Storm's getting worse," Harriet observed, her voice tight. She'd never liked storms, not since the tornado that had killed her husband 5 years ago. "Check that the barn door is secured. Last thing we need is the wind tearing it off." Lydia pulled on her shawl and headed out into the deluge. The rain was coming sideways now, cold and stinging against her face. She fought her way across the yard, her boots squelching in mud that was already ankle deep. The barn door was banging violently against its frame, the latch having come loose. Lydia struggled to secure it, her fingers numb and clumsy, when she heard something that made her blood run cold. A roar, low and deep like the earth itself, was tearing open. She turned toward the creek and in the next flash of lightning saw what she'd feared. The water was rising fast, spilling over its banks, a churning brown torrent that was already halfway up the yard. The spring melt combined with the heavy rain had turned the usually placid stream into something monstrous, and it was headed straight for the house. Lydia ran back inside, water streaming from her clothes. "Mrs. Cole, the creek! It's flooding! We have to get to higher ground!" Harriet rushed to the window, her face going pale. "Dear God, the barn!" Even as she spoke, there was a terrible groaning sound. Through the rain, they watched the old barn shudder list to one side and then collapse with a crash that was somehow audible even over the storm. Delilah's panicked scream cut through the night. "The horse!" Harriet moved toward the door, but Lydia grabbed her arm. "It's too dangerous. The water's too high." Harriet shook her off. "That horse is worth more than you'll ever be. Stay here." She grabbed a lantern and plunged out into the storm before Lydia could stop her. For a heartbeat, Lydia stood frozen. "Let her go," whispered a dark voice in her mind. "Let the flood take her. You'd be free." But even as the thought formed, her body was already moving, because beneath all the fear and pain and justified hatred, Lydia Grace had been raised by people who taught her that you saved lives when you could even lives that had shown you no mercy. She grabbed a rope from the kitchen and ran out into the maelstrom. The world was chaos, wind and water and darkness, broken only by lightning that turned everything into a nightmare landscape. Lydia could barely see Harriet's lantern bobbing near what was left of the barn, could barely hear anything over the roar of the flood. "Mrs. Cole!" she screamed, but the wind tore the words away. She reached the collapsed barn to find Harriet struggling with a beam that had pinned Delilah's leg. The horse was wild with terror, thrashing and screaming, and Harriet was in the water up to her waist, now trying desperately to lift the heavy timber. "Help me!" Harriet shouted when she saw Lydia. "We can save her! Help me lift it!" Together they strained against the beam, the water pulling at their legs, debris slamming into them from upstream. For a moment, just a moment, they weren't widow and ward, tormentor and victim. They were just two people fighting against the storm, trying to save something that still had life in it. The beam shifted. Delilah scrambled free and bolted past them toward higher ground. "Thank God," Harriet breathed. Then the current caught her. It happened so fast, Lydia almost missed it, Harriet's foot slipping on something underwater, her body going sideways, the flood grabbing her like a giant hand and pulling her under. She surfaced once, gasping, arms flailing. Lydia didn't think. She looped the rope around the one post still standing, tied it around her own waist with shaking fingers, and dove into the current. The water was shockingly cold and impossibly strong. It spun her around, filled her mouth and nose, tried to drag her down. But she'd grown up near rivers, had learned to swim before she could read, and muscle memory took over. She fought toward where she'd last seen Harriet, her hand outstretched, fingers grasping at darkness. Then she had her, a handful of dress, then an arm. Harriet was coughing, choking dead weight in the flood. Lydia hauled her close and kicked hard for the rope following it, hand over hand back to the post, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. She didn't know how long it took. Time had become meaningless, stretched and distorted like the lightning-lit world around them. But finally, she felt solid ground under her knees was dragging Harriet up onto the slight rise where the house still stood, both of them collapsing in the mud and gasping like landed fish. For several minutes they just lay there, too exhausted to move. The rain continued to pour down and the flood continued to rage, but they were alive. They had survived. Harriet rolled onto her side, coughing up water. When she could finally speak, her voice was raw and strange. "You saved me." Lydia didn't respond. She was staring up at the black sky, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. "You could have let me drown," Harriet Terwarpit continued. "God knows I've given you reason enough. Why didn't you?" "Because," Lydia said quietly, "I'm not you." The words hung between them like the rain, and for a moment something shifted in Harriet's face. Shame, maybe, or the first crack in whatever wall she'd built around her heart. But before either of them could say anything else, voices called out through the storm. "Hello, anyone here? Mrs. Cole." Sheriff Miller appeared through the downpour with 2 other men, all of them on horseback, lanterns swinging. They'd come to check on properties near the creek to warn people about the flood. "We're here," Harriet called back, struggling to her feet. "We're all right." The sheriff dismounted and hurried over, taking in their soaked, mud-covered state. "What happened? The barn's destroyed. Were you caught in it?" "The creek flooded. I went to save my horse and got caught in the current." Harriet's voice was steadier now, returning to its usual controlled tone. "Lydia pulled me out." Miller's eyebrows rose as he looked at Lydia with new assessment. "That was brave of you, girl." Lydia said nothing. Brave wasn't the word. Foolish, maybe, or simply human. One of the other men, a rancher named Carson, spoke up. "We should get you both somewhere dry. The water's still rising. Your house might not be safe much longer." "We'll manage," Harriet said stiffly. "Ma'am, with respect, the foundation's already compromised. Look." He pointed to where water was lapping at the porch steps. "Another hour and you'll be swimming in your own parlor." Harriet's jaw tightened. She hated accepting help, hated appearing weak or needy. But as another section of the fence collapsed into the flood with a crash, she had no choice. "The church has room," Miller said. "Reverend Pierce opened it up as a shelter for anyone affected by the flood. You can stay there until it's safe to come back." So they went, Lydia and Harriet riding double behind 2 of the men, all of them soaked and shivering, making their slow way toward town through the storm. Lydia kept her arms around the rancher's waist and watched the world slide past in flashes of lightning. Everything looked different in the storm, familiar landmarks transformed into alien shapes, the whole landscape rearranged by water and wind. She wondered if she was different too, if saving Harriet had changed something between them, or if the morning would come and find everything exactly as it had always been. The church was crowded with people displaced by the flood, families huddled on pews with blankets and lanterns, children sleeping in parents' laps, the smell of wet wool and coffee filling the air. Reverend Pierce was moving among them with quiet efficiency, offering comfort and practical help in equal measure. When he saw Harriet and Lydia, something complicated crossed his face, but he simply nodded and showed them to a corner where they could dry off and rest. "There's coffee on the stove," he said, "and Mrs. Henderson brought over some spare clothes. They might not fit perfect, but they're better than what you're wearing. You can change in the back room." Harriet thanked him with stiff formality and disappeared to change. Lydia was left standing there, dripping on the floor, aware of every eye in the room turning toward her. These were the people who'd heard Pierce's sermon. These were the people who knew or suspected what happened behind the walls of the Cole farm. And here she was, having just risked her life to save her tormentor. She couldn't read their expressions: pity, confusion, disappointment that she hadn't let nature take its course. Here, a woman's voice, kind and soft. Lydia turned to find Mrs. Henderson holding out a towel and a bundle of dry clothes. She was an older woman with gentle eyes and work-worn hands. "You poor dear. That was a terrible, brave thing you did. It wasn't brave, Lydia whispered. It was just what needed doing. Mrs. Henderson studied her for a long moment. Doing what needs doing, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you, that's the very definition of brave child. Don't let anyone tell you different. She guided Lydia to the back room where she could change in privacy. As Lydia peeled off her sodden clothes, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror on the wall. She looked like a drowned rat hair plastered to her head, face smudged with mud, eyes too large in a too thin face. But there was something else there too, something she hadn't seen in a long time, a flicker of strength, of agency. She had saved a life tonight. Whatever else was true, whatever tomorrow brought, that would always be true. She dressed in Mrs. Henderson's borrowed clothes, a simple cotton dress and shawl, and returned to the main room. Harriet was already there, wrapped in a blanket, accepting coffee from the Reverend. Their eyes met across the room, and for just a second, Lydia saw something in Harriet's expression that might have been gratitude. Then Sheriff Miller appeared at Harriet's elbow, his face grave. "Mrs. Cole, I need to speak with you, privately if possible." Harriet stiffened. "If this is about what Reverend Pierce said in his sermon, it's not. Well, not directly." Miller glanced around at the crowded room. "Maybe we could step outside under the overhang where it's quieter." Harriet set down her coffee and followed him out. Lydia watched them go, a sick feeling building in her stomach. Something was wrong. She could see it in the sheriff's posture, in the way he kept his voice low and urgent. She edged closer to the door, trying to hear. Other people were doing the same. In a small-town, privacy was more theory than practice. "Absolutely certain," Harriet's voice sharp with disbelief. "Saw it myself when we rode past your property again. The flood shifted something in that old cemetery plot on your land. You know, the one where the original homesteaders were buried." "What does that have to do with anything?" Miller's voice dropped even lower. "It exposed something, Mrs. Cole, a grave that wasn't on any map. Small, child-sized." The silence that followed was terrible. "And there's more," Miller continued, "John. When we looked closer, and I'm sorry, ma'am, I truly am, we found something wrapped in the remains of a blanket, a locket, silver with initials engraved, E.C. Harriet made a sound like all the air had been punched from her lungs. "Elizabeth Cole," Miller said gently. "Your daughter, Mrs. Cole, why is your daughter buried in an unmarked grave on your property instead of in the town cemetery where everyone believes she is?" Through the crack in the door, Lydia could see Harriet swaying her face, gray as ash. That's not possible. Elizabeth is buried on the hill under the cottonwood. We had a funeral, the whole town. There's a grave on the hill, yes, with a proper headstone, but it's empty, isn't it?" Miller's voice was heavy with something between sorrow and suspicion. "Mrs. Cole, I need you to tell me the truth. What happened to your daughter?" Harriet's composure shattered like the china cup Lydia had dropped. She crumpled against the church wall, her whole body shaking. "She died. Of course she died. The fever, everyone knew. Then why hide her body? Why the secret grave?" "Because," the word tore out of Harriet like a scream, "because I couldn't let them take her. The doctor said she had to be buried immediately, that the fever was too contagious, that she couldn't have a proper funeral. But she was my baby, my little girl. I couldn't let them put her in the ground without I needed time to—" She broke off sobbing now, years of carefully maintained control dissolving in the rain. Miller put a hand on her shoulder, his face full of pity. "So you buried her yourself, on your own land, and then told everyone the funeral had already happened?" Harriet nodded, unable to speak. "Mrs. Cole, I understand grief can make people do strange things, and normally this would be a private matter, but given recent concerns about your household, I have to ask." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Was there anything else unusual about Elizabeth's death? Anything that might explain why you felt the need to hide her burial?" Harriet's head snapped up, her eyes blazing through the tears. "Are you asking if I killed my own daughter? I'm asking if there's anything you need to tell me. How dare you? How dare you stand there and suggest she died of fever? The same fever that took half the children in the county that year. The doctor confirmed it. Then why the secrecy? Because I was out of my mind with grief. Harriet's voice broke. Because I'd already lost my husband to a tornado and couldn't bear to let go of my baby too. Because I thought if I kept her close, if I buried her where I could see her grave every day from my window, maybe the pain would be less. Does that satisfy you, Sheriff? Have you dug up enough of my agony for one night? Miller looked deeply uncomfortable. I'm sorry, ma'am, I had to ask, but this changes things. The Reverend's concerns, the way you've been treating your ward people, are going to talk. They're going to wonder if there's a pattern of what grief, desperation. I took that girl in when no one else would. I gave her food, shelter, a home, and beat her, came a quiet voice from behind them. They all turned. Reverend Pierce stood in the doorway, his face hard. You gave her a home and beat her. You fed her and terrorized her. You offered shelter and turned it into a prison. You know nothing about it, Harriet hissed. I know what I saw, and now I'm hearing about secret graves and lies that have lasted 8 years. So I'm going to ask you the same question the sheriff did, but more plainly. Mrs. Cole, did you harm your daughter? No. Did you harm Lydia? The question hung in the air. Everyone within earshot had gone quiet, listening. Harriet's face twisted with rage and shame and something that might have been recognition. I disciplined her. That's different. Is it? Pierce stepped closer. Because from where I stand, it looks like you've spent 2 years punishing an innocent girl for the crime of being alive when your daughter is dead. And now we find out that even in death you couldn't let Elizabeth go properly. What else are you holding on to? Mrs. Cole, what other pain are you spreading because you refuse to heal? Stop, Harriet whispered. No, not this time. That girl saved your life tonight, dove into a flooding creek to pull you out when she had every reason to let you drown. And tomorrow you'll go right back to beating her, won't you? Because that's what you do. You take the love you should be giving and twist it into violence. I said stop, but Pierce kept going, his voice rising. The question isn't what happened to Elizabeth. The question is what's going to happen to Lydia. Because I'll be damned if I stand by and watch another child suffer at your hands. Sheriff Miller held up a hand. Reverend, that's enough. Mrs. Cole, I think it's best if Lydia stays elsewhere for a time until we can sort out. She's my legal ward, and I'm the law in this county, Miller said firmly. And right now the law says that girl needs protecting. I'll be placing her in temporary custody elsewhere while we investigate what I've done. Nothing wrong. Then you won't mind us looking into things, where she'll be staying, whether there's cause for formal charges. Those are details we'll work out tomorrow. Tonight she stays here at the church and you stay somewhere else. Do we understand each other? Harriet looked between them, her face a mask of fury and desperation. For a moment Lydia thought she might refuse, might fight, might burn everything down rather than let go of her control. Then slowly Harriet nodded. Fine, but this isn't over, Sheriff. That girl is mine and I will get her back. The way she said it, that girl is mine, made Lydia's skin crawl. Not under my care or my ward, mine, like property, like a possession to be reclaimed. Harriet turned without another word and walked off into the rain, leaving behind a stunned silence. Pierce looked at Miller. You really think you can make a charge stick? She's got half the county in her pocket. Maybe not, but I can keep Lydia safe while we try. He paused. Question is, where do we place her? The orphanage in Topeka is full, and the workhouse, I'll take her. Everyone turned. Jonas Hale stood at the edge of the crowd, water dripping from his hat, his dark eyes steady and certain. Lydia hadn't even realized he was there. You, Miller frowned. Jonas, no offense, but you're a single man living alone. That's not exactly proper. My sister Martha lives with me, Jonas said quietly. Has for the past year since her husband died. Between the two of us we can provide a proper home, and my ranch is far enough from the Cole place that Mrs. Cole won't be showing up uninvited. Miller considered this. I don't know. This is irregular. Everything about this situation is irregular, Tom. That girl needs somewhere safe, somewhere she can heal. I'm offering. Jonas's gaze found Lydia's across the room. If she'll accept. Every eye in the church turned to her. Lydia stood frozen, her mind reeling. This morning she'd been gathering eggs. Tonight she'd saved a life, watched her world crack open, and now was being offered. What? Freedom. A different kind of cage. She looked at Jonas Hale, this stranger who'd ridden out to her farm with a lie about cattle, who'd whispered directions to his ranch like a secret map to salvation. She didn't know him, didn't know if she could trust him, didn't know if this was rescue or just a different kind of trap. But she knew what staying with Harriet would mean, knew it in her bones, in the scars on her back, in the fear that had become as familiar as breathing. I accept, she whispered. Jonas nodded once, then turned back to Miller. I'll bring her out to my place tomorrow once the roads are passable. You have my word, she'll be safe. See that she is, Miller said gruffly, because I'll be checking, regular. As the crowd slowly dispersed back to their own concerns, Lydia sank onto a pew and let the reality wash over her. She was leaving. After 2 years of praying for escape, it was actually happening, but as she lay down that night on a makeshift bed in the church, listening to the rain finally ease and the thunder roll away to the east, she couldn't shake the memory of Harriet's parting words, "That girl is mine and I will get her back." Somewhere out there in the darkness, the widow was planning, and Lydia knew with cold certainty that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The morning came soft and golden, the storm's fury spent and gone. Lydia woke on the church pew to the sound of birds and the smell of coffee brewing, and for a moment, just a moment, she forgot where she was. Then reality settled over her like a weight. Everything had changed. Jonas arrived just after sunrise, driving a wagon with his sister Martha beside him. Lydia watched from the church window as they climbed down Jonas, with his quiet, deliberate movements, and Martha, a woman perhaps 10 years older than him, with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. Sheriff Miller met them at the door, and there was a brief conversation Lydia couldn't hear. Then Martha was coming inside, her gaze sweeping the room until it found Lydia. "You must be Lydia," she said, her voice warm as summer honey. "I'm Martha Brennan, Jonas's sister. He tells me you're coming to stay with us for a while." Lydia nodded, unable to find words. She had nothing to pack, no belongings to gather. Everything she owned was still at the Cole farm, and the thought of going back there to retrieve it made her stomach clench. Martha seemed to understand without being told. "Don't you worry about clothes or such. I've got plenty we can alter to fit you, and what we don't have we can make or buy in town. You just bring yourself honey, that's all we need." It was the honey that did it, that casual endearment offered so freely to a stranger. Lydia felt something crack inside her chest, some wall she'd built to survive crumbling just a little. They made their goodbyes to Reverend Pierce, who pressed a small Bible into Lydia's hands. "For the dark times," he said quietly. "Remember, child, you are seen, you are valued, you are loved by God even when people fail you." Then she was climbing into the wagon between Jonas and Martha, leaving behind the only life she'd known for 2 years. As they rolled through town, people stopped to stare. Lydia kept her eyes down, feeling the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, their pity. But Martha chatted on, seemingly oblivious to the attention, pointing out landmarks and telling stories. "That's where the miller's son proposed to the blacksmith's daughter last spring, right in the middle of Main Street, got down on one knee in the mud. And there's Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. She makes the best apple pie in 3 counties, I swear it. You'll have to try it sometime." Lydia listened to the easy flow of words and felt something inside her begin to unknot. This was what normal people sounded like. This was what it felt like to be treated like a person, not a problem to be solved or a mistake to be punished. The ride out to the Hale ranch took the better part of 2 hours. They left the town behind and traveled through rolling prairie that seemed to stretch forever, grass rippling in the wind like a green ocean. The sky was impossibly blue after the storm washed clean and bright. "It's beautiful out here," Lydia whispered, the first words she'd spoken since leaving the church. Jonas glanced at her, something softening in his usually stern features. "It is. Wait till you see it in spring when the wildflowers bloom. Looks like God spilled a paint box across the whole territory." Jonas used to say that to his wife, Martha added gently. Sarah loved the wildflowers. She'd pick them by the armful and put them in every room of the house. There was a moment of silence, comfortable and sad at once. Lydia wanted to ask about Sarah, about what had happened, but the words felt too intrusive. Jonas's grief was visible in the way he held himself, the careful distance he maintained from the world. "There it is," Martha said, pointing ahead. "Home." The house came into view, white-clapboard with a wide porch, just as Jonas had described to her that day at the farm. The red barn stood behind it, solid and well-maintained, and beyond that were corrals where horses grazed in the morning sun. It was modest but well-kept, the kind of place that spoke of steady work and quiet pride. As they pulled up to the house, a massive dog came bounding out, some kind of shepherd mix, with a tail that never stopped wagging. He jumped up against the wagon tongue, lolling, clearly delighted by the arrival of a stranger. "That's Bear," Jonas said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "He's friendly, just doesn't know his own size. Bear down." The dog obeyed reluctantly, circling the wagon and whining with excitement as Lydia climbed down. She offered her hand for him to sniff, and he immediately tried to lick every inch of exposed skin. "He likes you," Martha laughed. "That's a good sign. Come on, let me show you around." The house was simple. Inside, a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen with a big wooden table, and 2 bedrooms on the ground floor. A ladder led up to a loft space under the eaves. "That's Jonas's room up there," Martha explained. "You'll take the spare room down here. It's small, but it's got a nice window facing east, so you'll get the morning sun. I'm in the room next to the kitchen. There's a washroom out back, and we've got a proper outhouse, not just a hole in the ground." She said it all so matter-of-factly, as if Lydia was a normal guest, a visiting relative, someone who deserved consideration. It was overwhelming. The spare room was indeed small, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a dresser, and a washstand. But it was clean and bright, with cheerful yellow curtains at the window and a quilt on the bed that looked handmade. "This was going to be the nursery," Martha said softly, running her hand over the dresser. "Sarah was expecting when she took sick. They lost both her and the baby." She paused, her eyes distant. "Jonas hasn't let anyone use this room since, but when he heard about you, he said it was time, said Sarah would have wanted it used for something good." Lydia stood in the doorway, unable to step inside. "I can't, this is too much. I shouldn't." "Nonsense," Martha said firmly. "You're here now, and this is your room. Jonas doesn't do things halfway, honey. When he decides to help someone, he commits. It's just his way." She left Lydia to settle in, though there was nothing to settle. Lydia sat on the edge of the bed, soft, so much softer than the thin mattress in the Cole attic, and tried to understand what was happening. Freedom felt strange. Kindness felt dangerous. Safety felt like a trap waiting to spring. She heard voices outside and moved to the window. Jonas was unhitching the horses while Martha hung laundry on the line, and they were talking in low tones, not arguing, just the easy conversation of people who knew each other well. This is what family looked like, Lydia realized. Not perfect, but peaceful. Not demanding, but dependable. A knock on the doorframe made her turn. Jonas stood there, hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable in the way men do when dealing with young girls' feelings. "Wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. "I know this is all sudden. Strange. Why are you doing this?" The question burst out before Lydia could stop it. "You don't know me. I'm nothing to you." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough with old pain. "My pa was a hard man. Believed the only way to raise a boy was to beat the weakness out of him. I left home at 14 with scars on my back and hatred in my heart." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I swore if I ever had the chance to stand between a child and that kind of cruelty, I'd do it, no matter what it cost. But I'm not your responsibility. Maybe not. But you're a human being who deserves safety and kindness. That makes you everybody's responsibility." He paused. You don't have to trust me, Lydia. You don't have to trust any of this. Just let us show you that not everyone in the world is cruel. That's all I'm asking." Before Lydia could respond, Martha's voice called from outside. "Jonas, you better come see this." There was something urgent in her tone. Jonas's jaw tightened, and he moved quickly to the door. Lydia followed, her heart suddenly racing. In the yard, Martha stood pointing toward the eastern horizon. A rider was approaching fast, pushing his horse hard. As he got closer, Lydia recognized him. It was young Billy Watts, who worked at the general store in town. He pulled up in a spray of dust, breathing hard. "Mr. Hale, Sheriff Miller sent me. There's trouble. Mrs. Cole, she's filed a complaint. Says you kidnapped her ward, that the sheriff had no authority to place the girl with you. She's got Judge Morrison involved. He's her father, remember? They're saying you have to return Lydia by sunset or face charges." The words hit like physical blows. Lydia felt the room tilt, felt all the hope that had begun to grow in her chest wither and die. Of course Harriet wouldn't let go. Of course her influence would win. Jonas's face had gone hard as stone. Judge Morrison is her father. This was never going to be simple. "There's more," Billy continued. "She's spreading talk around town, saying you took Lydia for improper purposes. That a single man with a young girl under his roof, it's not decent. People are listening, Mr. Hale. They're starting to talk." Martha made a sound of disgust. "That's slander, pure and simple." "Maybe so, ma'am, but it's working. Judge Morrison is set to rule this afternoon. Says the girl goes back to her legal guardian unless there's proof of wrongdoing, and Mrs. Cole says there isn't any." "The preacher saw," Jonas started. "The preacher saw her disciplining her ward. That's how Mrs. Cole is spinning it. And without Lydia's testimony, without her willing to speak up about what happened, there's no case." Billy looked at Lydia with pity. "The sheriff says it's up to you, miss. You willing to stand before the judge and tell what she did?" Every eye turned to Lydia. She felt the weight of their expectation, their hope, their need for her to be brave. But bravery was a luxury she couldn't afford. Speaking up meant facing Harriet in court, meant reliving every moment of pain, meant risking everything if the judge, Harriet's own father, decided his daughter's word was worth more than an orphan's truth. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I can't." The disappointment in the room was palpable, but Jonas just nodded slowly. "Then we'll find another way." "What other way?" Martha demanded. "If she won't testify, if the judge is in Harriet's pocket?" "There's always another way," Jonas said quietly. But his eyes were troubled. Billy cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. Mrs. Cole is offering a reward, $50 to anyone who brings Lydia back before sunset. There's men in town already talking about coming out here to collect." "Let them come," Jonas said, and there was steel in his voice now. "This is my land, my home. No one takes anyone from here against their will." After Billy left, the three of them stood in the yard, the morning that had started so hopefully now shadowed with threat. Lydia felt the familiar weight of guilt settling over her shoulders. This was her fault. Her presence here was causing trouble, putting these kind people at risk. "I should go back," she said quietly, "before someone gets hurt." "No," Jonas's voice was firm. "You're not going back to that house, to that woman. We'll figure this out." But how Lydia wanted to ask. How do you fight power and influence and blood ties? How do you win when the system is designed to protect people like Harriet and dismiss people like her? The answer came that night, but not in any way they expected. Lydia had been given chores, simple things, Martha assured her, just to help her feel useful. feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, helping prepare supper. It felt strange to work without fear, to do tasks knowing that a mistake wouldn't end in pain. When she accidentally dropped a spoon at dinner, she flinched automatically, her body preparing for the blow. But Jonas just picked it up and handed it back to her. "No harm done," he said simply. Those 3 words nearly undid her. No harm done. As if mistakes were just part of living, not crimes requiring punishment. They were washing up after supper when Bear started barking, not his happy, excited bark, but something deeper, more alarmed. Jonas moved to the window, his body tensing. "Riders," he said. 3, maybe 4, coming fast. Martha quickly moved to the gun cabinet, pulling out a rifle. "The men Billy warned us about, maybe." Jonas grabbed his own rifle. "Or maybe someone with an actual legal writ. Either way, Lydia, I want you upstairs in my loft. Stay there until we know what's what." Lydia climbed the ladder with shaking hands, Bear following her up, despite his size, clearly sensing her fear. From the loft window she could see the riders approaching, dark shapes against the twilight, moving with purpose. They stopped in the yard, and Lydia's heart sank when she recognized the lead rider, Carson, the rancher who'd helped rescue them from the flood. Beside him were 2 men she didn't know, rough-looking types who had the air of drifters about them. Jonas stepped out onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. "Carson, didn't expect to see you out this way." "No pleasure in this, Jonas," Carson called back. "But Mrs. Cole is offering good money and times are hard. Nothing personal." "Everything's personal when you're talking about taking a child back to someone who beats her." One of the drifters spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "We got a legal right. Judge's order says the girl goes back." "I haven't seen any judge's order," Jonas said coolly. "You got papers." There was a pause. Carson shifted in his saddle. "It's being drawn up. But everyone knows what Harriet Cole says. That's not the same as law." Jonas's voice was hard. "Now I'm going to ask you men to leave my property. Whatever Mrs. Cole is paying, it's not worth what'll happen if you try to take that girl." The second drifter laughed a mean sound. "That a threat, old man? It's a promise." The tension stretched tight as wire. Lydia watched from above, her heart hammering, Bear pressed against her side. This was going to turn violent. She could feel it in the air, could see it in the way Jonas's finger moved closer to the trigger. Then Martha stepped out onto the porch beside her brother, her own rifle raised. "You boys should listen to Jonas. He's being polite. I won't be." Carson looked between them, calculation in his eyes. "There's 3 of us, and you'll be dead before you clear leather," Martha said flatly. "Jonas was a sharpshooter in the war. I taught him everything he knows. You want to test us, go ahead. But someone's mama is going to be crying at a funeral, and it won't be ours." For a long moment no one moved. Then Carson slowly raised his hands. "Like I said, nothing personal. We're going." He wheeled his horse around, and the drifters followed, though the mean one kept looking back with hatred in his eyes. They rode off into the gathering darkness, and Lydia finally remembered to breathe. Jonas and Martha stood on the porch until the riders were out of sight, then came back inside. Jonas climbed up to the loft where Lydia sat trembling. "You all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "They'll be back," he said, "with more men probably, and maybe with actual legal authority next time." He sighed, rubbing his face. "Lydia, I meant what I said earlier. You don't have to testify if you're not ready, but these people, they're not going to stop. Harriet's not going to stop. Eventually, we're going to have to fight this in a way that actually wins." "I'm scared," Lydia whispered. "I know, that's all right. Being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave too." He paused. "Think on it. That's all I ask. Think on whether facing Harriet one more time with people on your side this time, people who believe you, might be worth the fear." He left her there in the loft, and Lydia curled up in the corner, with Bear staring out at the darkening prairie. Somewhere out there, Harriet was plotting. Somewhere out there, men were gathering, drawn by money, and the widow's influence, and somewhere deep inside herself, Lydia felt a tiny spark of anger beginning to burn. She'd spent 2 years being afraid, 2 years accepting pain as her lot in life, 2 years believing she deserved the cruelty because she was alive and Elizabeth was dead. But she'd also saved Harriet's life. She'd jumped into a flooding creek and pulled a drowning woman to safety. That took strength. That took courage. Maybe, just maybe, she had enough of both to fight back. The spark grew a little brighter. The next 2 days passed in tense waiting. Sheriff Miller came by to check on Lydia, looking tired and frustrated. Judge Morrison had indeed issued an order for Lydia's return, but Miller was dragging his feet on enforcing it, claiming he needed time to verify the legality. "It won't hold forever," he told Jonas privately, though Lydia heard from her spot in the kitchen. "Morrison's getting pressure from Harriet, and she's got friends, important ones, unless we can give the judge a reason to reverse his decision." "We're working on it," Jonas said, though Lydia wasn't sure what he meant. Martha took Lydia into town that second day, insisting she needed a proper dress or two. Lydia protested it seemed wasteful to buy things when she might be dragged back to the Cole farm any moment, but Martha wouldn't hear it. "You're here now, and while you're here, you'll be properly clothed. Besides," she added with a wink, "maybe looking like a young lady instead of a waif will remind people you're a person, not property." The general store went quiet when they entered. Lydia felt eyes on her from every corner, heard the whispers start, but Martha held her head high and marched straight to the fabric section. Mrs. Henderson was there, and her face lit up when she saw them. "Martha and Lydia, dear, I'm so glad to see you looking better. Let's find you something nice, shall we?" Between the two women, they picked out fabric for 2 dresses, one practical calico for every day, one nicer cotton for church. Lydia stood numbly while they measured and discussed patterns, feeling like a doll being dressed. As Mrs. Henderson was wrapping the fabric, a woman's voice cut through the store. "Well, if it isn't the little thief." Lydia turned to see Mrs. Blackwell, one of Harriet's closest friends, standing with her arms crossed and judgment written all over her face. "Excuse me." Martha's voice was dangerously quiet. "That girl stole from Harriet Cole, ran away after nearly getting her killed in that flood, and now she's living in sin with a man who's not her husband, not her father, nothing proper at all." The store went completely silent. Lydia wanted to sink through the floor, but Martha stepped forward, putting herself between Lydia and Mrs. Blackwell. First of all, Lydia saved Mrs. Cole's life in that flood, as multiple witnesses can attest. Second, she didn't run anywhere. She was placed in our care by the sheriff for her own safety. And third, I live in that house too, so you can take your vile insinuations. And, ladies, Mr. Henderson interrupted, moving between them. "Please, this isn't the place." "You're right," Martha said, gathering the wrapped fabric. "Come on, Lydia. We don't need to stay where lies are welcome, but truth is not." As they left, Lydia heard Mrs. Blackwell say loudly, "Mark my words, that girl will bring nothing but trouble to the Hale house, nothing but trouble and shame." In the wagon heading home, Lydia finally broke. "She's right. I am bringing trouble. You should let me go back. It's not worth—" "Stop." Martha's voice was firm but kind. "Listen to me, honey. There are people in this world who feed on cruelty, who take their own pain and spread it like poison. Harriet Cole is one, Mrs. Blackwell is another, and if we let people like that dictate how we live, how we love, how we help each other, then they've won. You understand?" Lydia shook her head. "You are worth fighting for," Martha said simply, "not because of what you can do or what you've survived, just because you're a human soul that deserves kindness. Jonas sees that. I see that. And eventually, you'll see it too." That night, Lydia couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, looking out at the moon-washed prairie, thinking about worth and cruelty, and whether she'd ever really be free of Harriet's shadow. That's when she smelled the smoke. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but Bear started whining, pacing at the door. Then she heard it, the crackle of flames, the whicker of frightened horses. "Fire!" she screamed, running for the door. "The barn's on fire!" She hit the yard, running, not thinking, just moving. The barn was fully ablaze, flames shooting from the hayloft, the horses inside screaming in terror. Jonas was already there in his nightshirt, throwing open the stall doors, trying to get the animals out. "Help me!" he shouted when he saw her. Lydia ran into the smoke and chaos, grabbing halters, pulling terrified horses toward safety. The heat was immense, the smoke choking. She got 2 horses out, then went back for Cedar, Jonas's favorite, a beautiful chestnut mare that Sarah had loved. Cedar was panicking, rearing and striking, eyes rolling white with fear. Lydia dodged her hooves, managed to grab the halter, and was pulling her toward the door when she heard the terrible sound of breaking wood. A burning beam was falling right toward Jonas, who was trying to free the last horse. He didn't see it, couldn't hear her warning over the roar of the flames. Lydia didn't think. She shoved Cedar toward the door and threw herself at Jonas, hitting him, with all her weight knocking him sideways just as the beam crashed down where he'd been standing. They hit the ground hard, Lydia on top of Jonas, sparks raining down around them. For a moment they just lay there, stunned and gasping. Then Jonas was pulling them both up, dragging her out of the barn, just as more of the roof collapsed. They fell onto the grass outside, coughing and choking. Martha was there with blankets. Bear was barking frantically, and the barn was nothing but a tower of flame against the night sky. "You saved my life," Jonas gasped, looking at Lydia with something like wonder. "You could have run, should have run, but you came back for me." "You came back for me first," Lydia said simply. They watched the barn burn, knowing there was nothing to be done but let it go. The horses were safe, milling in the corral. That was what mattered. But as the flames died down and the first gray light of dawn began to show, they found something that made Jonas's blood run cold. Behind the barn, partially hidden in the grass, were the remains of torches, crude things made of rags and kerosene. "This was no accident," Martha breathed. "Someone set this deliberately." Jonas's jaw was tight with fury. Carson and those drifters, or someone Harriet paid, doesn't matter which, they were trying to burn us out. "Or worse," Martha said quietly, looking at Lydia. "What if this was meant to force your hand, to scare you into giving her back?" But before anyone could answer, they heard the sound of approaching riders, a lot of them. Sheriff Miller arrived with what looked like half the town men with buckets, women with medical supplies, all of them staring at the smoking ruin of the Hale barn. Behind them, looking perfectly composed despite the early hour, was Harriet Cole. "What a terrible tragedy," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "Sheriff, I think this proves what I've been saying. That man cannot protect that child. Look at the danger he's put her in. She could have died in this fire." "Funny thing about that," Jonas said, his voice deadly calm. "This fire didn't start by accident, Mrs. Cole. Someone set it deliberately. Now who do you suppose would want to hurt me and mine?" Harriet's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of arson, Mr. Hale?" "I'm saying it's mighty convenient. You've been trying to get Lydia back by legal means. When that didn't work fast enough, suddenly my barn burns down." "That's slander," Harriet said coldly. "Sheriff, I demand you arrest this man for defamation." Miller looked between them, clearly torn. The crowd murmured and shifted, some nodding in agreement with Harriet, others looking uncertain. Then Reverend Pierce pushed through the crowd, and there was something in his hand. "Sheriff, I found something you need to see. One of the drifters who was here the other day, the mean one, he got drunk last night and started bragging. Said Mrs. Cole paid him to smoke out the problem. Paid him $50 to set fire to the Hale place." He held up a charred piece of cloth. "This was in his room at the boarding house, matches the torches behind the barn, and Mrs. Henderson heard him say she's prepared to testify." The crowd erupted. Harriet's face went white, then red, then twisted with rage. "That's a lie. I would never. There's more," Pierce continued relentlessly. "I've been doing some digging, Mrs. Cole, about your daughter Elizabeth, about the way she really died." The world seemed to stop. Harriet swayed on her feet, and for a moment Lydia thought she might faint. "What are you talking about?" Miller demanded. Pierce looked at Harriet with something like pity. "The doctor who treated Elizabeth, old Doc Sawyer, who retired to Topeka. I wrote to him, asked him about the scarlet fever epidemic 8 years ago. He wrote back yesterday." Pierce pulled a letter from his pocket. "He says Elizabeth Cole didn't die of scarlet fever. She died of pneumonia brought on by, and I quote, prolonged exposure to cold and damp conditions inconsistent with proper care." The crowd's murmur grew louder, more agitated. Harriet was shaking her head, backing away. No, that's not, he's lying. He's old, confused. He says he told you at the time that Elizabeth needed to be kept warm and dry, that her fever was from her lungs being compromised. But you, grieving your husband half out of your mind, you made her sleep in the cold room, the one with the broken window you never fixed, because Thomas had always meant to do it, but died before he could. "Stop," Harriet whispered. "You didn't mean to kill her," Pierce said gently, "but you did, through neglect born of your own grief, and you've spent 8 years punishing Lydia for being alive when Elizabeth is dead by your own hand." The silence that followed was absolute. Lydia stared at Harriet and saw the truth written on her face, the guilt, the shame, the terrible knowledge she'd been running from for 8 years. Harriet's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the ground, her perfect composure finally completely shattered. "I didn't mean to," she sobbed. I loved her so much. But I was so angry at God for taking Thomas, and I stopped caring about anything, and I didn't notice how sick she was getting, and by the time I did, she broke off, her body racked with sobs that seemed to tear her apart from the inside. Judge Morrison pushed through the crowd, his face gray. "Harriet, oh Harriet, what have you done? I killed her papa." Harriet wept. "I killed my baby. And then I took Lydia because I thought I could make it right. But every time I looked at her, I saw Elizabeth, and I hated her for living when Elizabeth was dead because of me." She crumpled completely, and her father knelt beside her, this powerful judge, reduced to a broken old man holding his broken daughter. Sheriff Miller looked at Jonas, then at Lydia, his face heavy with the weight of what he had to do. "Mrs. Cole, I'm placing you under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and—" He paused, looking at the weeping woman with pity. "We'll need to investigate Elizabeth's death, officially." As deputies moved to take Harriet away, she looked up at Lydia one last time. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For all of it. For everything. I'm so sorry." Lydia stood there, Martha's arm around her shoulders, Jonas solid beside her, and tried to feel something: triumph, relief, satisfaction. But all she felt was a vast, echoing sadness for everyone involved. For Elizabeth dead because grief made her mother blind. For Harriet poisoned by guilt into poisoning others. For herself caught in the wake of someone else's tragedy. "It's over," Jonas said quietly. "She can't hurt you anymore." But Lydia knew it wasn't quite that simple. Harriet might be going to prison, the threat might be ended, but the scars, physical and otherwise, would take much longer to heal, if they ever did. The trial was set for 3 weeks later, giving everyone time to prepare, though nothing could truly prepare Lydia for what was coming. She spent those weeks at the Hale Ranch in a strange state between relief and dread, learning what it meant to live without fear, even as she anticipated the moment when she'd have to face it again. Martha taught her to bake bread, the kind that rose properly and had a golden crust. Jonas showed her how to care for Cedar, how to brush her coat until it gleamed, and talked to her in the low, soothing voice that horses understood. Bear followed her everywhere, a constant warm presence that seemed to sense when the memories got too heavy and would push his nose into her hand until she came back to the present. At night she still woke gasping from dreams of whips and floods and fire. But now, when she cried, there was someone who heard. Martha would appear with warm milk and sit beside her bed, not offering empty platitudes, just being present until the demons retreated. "Healing isn't a straight line," Martha told her one such night. "It's more like a spiral. You think you're going in circles, covering the same ground over and over. But if you look close, you'll see you're actually moving up even when it doesn't feel like it. Lydia wanted to believe her. Some days she almost did. The town was in an uproar over what had happened. Judge Morrison had recused himself from the case, his own grief and shame making it impossible for him to sit in judgment. A circuit judge named Cartwright had been brought in from Topeka, a stern man with a reputation for fairness that bordered on harshness. Sheriff Miller had arrested the drifter who'd set the fire. The man had confessed everything once confronted, probably hoping for leniency. He was awaiting trial in a separate cell from Harriet, whose own father had insisted she be held in the town jail rather than released on bond. "She's a danger," Morrison had said, and no one argued. The fire had proven that. Reverend Pierce had become an unexpected ally, visiting the ranch regularly to check on Lydia and to prepare her as gently as he could for what testifying would mean. "They're going to ask you to show your scars," he said one afternoon, sitting across from her at the kitchen table while Martha kneaded dough nearby. "The judge will need to see evidence of abuse. I know that's frightening." "It's humiliating," Lydia corrected quietly. "Having strangers stare at my back like it's evidence in a crime instead of part of me. I know, and I'm sorry, but it's the only way to make sure Harriet faces real consequences. The arson charge is serious, but without proof of the abuse, a good lawyer might argue she was just a desperate woman trying to protect her ward." Lydia traced patterns on the table with her finger. "What if I can't do it? What if I get up there and freeze?" "Then you freeze and we find another way," Jonas said from the doorway. Neither of them had heard him come in. "Lydia, I want Harriet to pay for what she did, but not at the cost of destroying you in the process. You speak up when and if you're ready, not before." But Lydia was beginning to understand that being ready was a luxury she might never have. Sometimes you just had to do the hard thing while you were still terrified, trusting that courage would catch up eventually. The day before the trial, Mrs. Henderson came to visit, bringing with her a dress she'd made specially. It was simple but beautiful, deep blue cotton with a white collar, modest and dignified. "For tomorrow," she said, pressing it into Lydia's hands, "so you can stand before that judge knowing you look like the respectable young lady you are, not some waif to be pitied." Lydia held the dress and felt tears prick her eyes. "Why are you being so kind to me? You barely know me." Mrs. Henderson's own eyes grew misty. "Because I had a daughter once. She'd be about your age now if she'd lived. And I like to think if she'd needed help, someone would have been kind to her too." She touched Lydia's cheek gently. "We're all connected, honey. Your pain is our pain. Your healing is our healing. That's what community means." That night, Lydia laid the blue dress out carefully and tried to imagine herself wearing it, standing in a courtroom telling the truth. The image wouldn't quite form. Every time she tried, she saw Harriet's face, not the broken, sobbing woman from the day of the fire, but the cold, controlled widow who'd raised the whip with such precision. She was still awake when Jonas knocked softly on her doorframe. "Can't sleep either." "No, sir." He came in and sat in the chair by her bed, looking older than his 40 years in the lamplight. "I've been thinking about my pa, about the day I finally stood up to him. I was 14 and he'd taken a strap to me for some minor thing, don't even remember what now. But this time, when he raised his hand for another strike, I caught his wrist." Lydia watched him, seeing the boy he'd been in the hard lines of his face. "I looked him in the eye and I said, 'No more.' That's all. Just those 2 words. And something shifted. He saw that I wasn't a child anymore, that I was big enough and angry enough to fight back. He lowered the strap. Never hit me again." Jonas paused. "I left the next morning anyway. Couldn't stay in that house even without the beatings. The damage was done." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because tomorrow when you stand before that judge, you're going to say your own version of no more. You're going to take back the power Harriet stole from you. And it's going to be hard, maybe the hardest thing you ever do, but on the other side of it, you'll be free. Really free, not just physically, but in your soul." What if I'm not strong enough? Jonas smiled, and it transformed his usually stern face. Lydia, you jumped into a flood to save the woman who beat you. You ran into a burning barn to save horses and a fool man who didn't see a beam falling. You've survived 2 years of cruelty that would have broken most people. You're already strong enough. You just don't know it yet. After he left, Lydia finally slept, and for once her dreams were not of whips and fire, but of wide open prairie and wildflowers blooming across the hills. The courthouse was packed when they arrived the next morning. It seemed the whole county had turned out for the trial, some out of genuine concern, others drawn by the spectacle of a prominent family's fall from grace. Lydia walked between Jonas and Martha wearing Mrs. Henderson's blue dress and holding her head as high as she could manage. She saw familiar faces in the crowd. Mrs. Blackwell looking sour and judgmental. Carson, the rancher who had the grace to look ashamed when their eyes met. Billy Watts from the general store offering an encouraging nod. And there, in the front row, Judge Morrison sat with his head bowed, looking like he'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. Harriet was already seated at the defendant's table with her lawyer, a sharp-faced man from Topeka named Aldrich. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, her black dress hanging loose on a frame that had lost weight. When she saw Lydia, something flickered in her eyes, regret maybe, or fear. Lydia looked away. Judge Cartwright entered, and everyone rose. He was a tall man with the iron-gray hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His voice when he spoke was crisp and authoritative. This court is now in session. We're here to address charges against Mrs. Harriet Cole, arson, attempted murder, and assault of a minor in her care. How does the defendant plead? Aldrich stood smoothly. Not guilty, Your Honor. Mrs. Cole is a grieving widow who has been maliciously slandered by people seeking to take advantage of her recent losses and emotional state. The prosecutor, a bulldog of a man named Stevens from the county seat, snorted. Grieving widow or not, the evidence will show Mrs. Cole engaged in a systematic pattern of abuse against her ward, culminating in an attempt to murder Mr. Jonas Hale and his family by arson. And so it began. Stevens called witness after witness, building his case piece by piece. Reverend Pierce testified about what he'd seen in the barn that first day. Sheriff Miller described the secret grave and the investigation that followed. Doc Sawyer's written statement was read aloud, detailing Elizabeth's true cause of death and Harriet's negligence. The drifter, looking haggard and defeated, testified that Harriet had paid him $50 to burn out the problem, though he claimed he thought that meant the barn only, not the house. Mrs. Henderson confirmed hearing his drunken confession. Through it all, Harriet sat motionless, her face a mask, but Lydia could see her hands trembling in her lap, could see the way she flinched at each damning piece of evidence. Then Stevens called Lydia to the stand. The walk from her seat to the witness box felt miles long. Every eye in the courtroom was on her. She could hear whispers, could feel the weight of their curiosity and judgment. Her legs shook so badly she wasn't sure they'd carry her, but somehow they did. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The whole truth, nothing but the truth. The words felt heavy, binding like chains or wings. She wasn't sure which. Stevens approached with a kindly expression. Miss Grace, please tell the court how you came to live with Mrs. Cole. Lydia's voice came out barely above a whisper. My parents died of fever. I was 14. The pastor said Mrs. Cole had agreed to take me in to give me a home. And what was life like in that home? She looked at her hands, at the calluses earned from farm work, at the scars on her knuckles from 100 small punishments. At first it was all right. Mrs. Cole was strict but not cruel. But after a few weeks, things changed. She started finding fault with everything I did. Nothing was ever good enough. Can you give the court an example? Lydia took a breath. If I burned the bread, she'd make me go without supper. If I was too slow with chores, she'd lock me in the cellar overnight. If I broke something or made a mistake, her voice cracked, she'd take me to the barn and whip me. A murmur went through the courtroom. Judge Cartwright banged his gavel. "Order." Stephen's voice was gentle. How often did these whippings occur? Once or twice a week in the beginning. By the end, it was almost daily. She said she was making me strong, teaching me that the world was cruel, so I'd know how to survive it. "Did you ever try to seek help?" Lydia nodded. "Once. I went to the pastor, but Mrs. Cole was there when I arrived, and she told him I was prone to lying, to making up stories for attention. He believed her. After that, she whipped me for bearing false witness." "Miss Grace, the court needs to see evidence of this abuse. I'm sorry to ask this, but would you be willing to show the judge your scars?" This was the moment she'd been dreading and preparing for. Lydia looked out at the courtroom and found Jonas's eyes. He nodded slightly, and she saw in his face the same determination she'd seen when he'd stood up to his own father. "No more." "Yes," she whispered. "I'll show them." Martha came forward to help her, standing as a shield, while Lydia turned her back to the courtroom and lowered the collar of her dress. The scars were there, dozens of them, crisscrossing her shoulder blades and upper back, some old and faded, others still pink and new. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, exclamations, even a few sobs. Judge Cartwright didn't even try to restore order for a moment, just sat staring at Lydia's back with an expression of horror and rage. When Lydia had composed herself and returned to her seat, the judge's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Mr. Aldrich, I assume you'll want to cross-examine the witness." Aldrich stood, but his earlier confidence had evaporated. "Miss Grace, is it possible you're exaggerating the frequency of these punishments? That your memory clouded by emotion?" "No," Lydia said, and her voice was stronger now. "I remember every time, every reason, every scar. But you did make mistakes, didn't you? Break things, forget chores. Perhaps Mrs. Cole was simply trying to teach you responsibility." "By beating me," Lydia's voice rose, "by making me believe I was worthless, that I deserved pain because I wasn't perfect." She stood up and Stevens didn't stop her. "I was a child who'd lost everything, and instead of giving me comfort, she gave me torment. Instead of love, she gave me wounds. You want to call that teaching responsibility? I call it evil." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Evil, simple and devastating, and true. Aldrich opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no response to that kind of raw honesty. "No further questions," he muttered, tired. But Lydia wasn't done. She turned to face Harriet directly, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, Harriet met her eyes. "I saved your life," Lydia said quietly, but her voice carried in the silent room. "I pulled you from that flood when I could have let you drown. Do you know why?" Harriet shook her head mutely, tears streaming down her face. "Because I knew that hate destroys the person who carries it, even more than the person it's aimed at. You spent 8 years hating yourself for what happened to Elizabeth, and you turned that hate on me. But I won't do the same. I won't let what you did to me poison who I am." She took a shaky breath. "I forgive you, Mrs. Cole, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free of you. And I can't be free while I'm carrying anger and bitterness. So I forgive you, and I pray someday you'll forgive yourself." The silence that followed was profound. Even Judge Cartwright seemed moved, his stern face softened with something like respect. "Miss Grace," he said quietly, "you may step down." Lydia walked back to her seat on trembling legs. Martha immediately put an arm around her, and Jonas squeezed her shoulder. She'd done it. She'd told the truth, shown the scars, faced her tormentor, and somehow, impossibly, she felt lighter. The trial continued with closing arguments, but the outcome was never in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, and Lydia's testimony had been devastating. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their verdict. On the charge of arson, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault and abuse of a minor, we find the defendant guilty. Harriet collapsed in her chair, weeping. Her father Morrison put his face in his hands. Judge Cartwright's voice was heavy with disgust as he pronounced sentence, "Mrs. Cole, your crimes are particularly heinous because they were committed against a child in your care. However, the court acknowledges your severe mental distress following the deaths of your husband and daughter. You are hereby sentenced to 10 years in the women's prison in Lansing, with the possibility of parole after 7 years if you show genuine rehabilitation." He paused, his eyes finding Lydia. "Additionally, all legal guardianship is permanently revoked. Miss Lydia Grace is hereby declared a ward of the state with temporary custody granted to Mr. Jonas Hale and Miss Martha Brennan pending formal adoption proceedings." Lydia's heart stopped. Adoption. They wanted to adopt her, to make her not just a temporary resident, but actual family. She looked at Jonas, who was smiling, really smiling for the first time since she'd met him. Martha was crying happy tears, squeezing Lydia's hand so tight it hurt. As the bailiffs led Harriet away, she looked back one last time. Her lips moved, forming words Lydia could read even without sound. "Thank you. For the forgiveness. For the mercy. For the grace she'd never shown, but had received anyway." Then she was gone, and the courtroom erupted in conversation. People surged forward to congratulate Jonas and Martha, to touch Lydia's shoulder or offer words of encouragement. It was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Reverend Pierce found her in the crowd. "You were magnificent, child, truly magnificent. That forgiveness you offered, that was the love of God working through you." "I don't feel very godly," Lydia admitted. "I feel exhausted and angry and sad all at once." "That's all right. Forgiveness doesn't mean you're not allowed to feel the hurt. It just means you're not going to let the hurt define you." He smiled. "You're going to be just fine, Lydia Grace. Better than fine." Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was bright and warm. Spring was coming early to Kansas, and the first wildflowers were already starting to bloom on the hillsides. Lydia stood on the steps and looked out at the town, the same buildings, the same streets, but somehow everything looked different now. She was free, really, truly free, not just from Harriet, but from the shame and fear and worthlessness that had been beaten into her. She had spoken her truth, shown her scars, and been believed, been valued, been chosen. Jonas came to stand beside her. "You ready to go home? Home." The words settled over her like a blessing. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." As they walked to the wagon, Lydia noticed something that made her pause. There, pressed into Martha's hand by someone in the crowd, was a photograph. Old and faded, but still clear enough to make out the faces. "What's that?" Lydia asked. Martha's face had gone pale. I'm not sure. Someone just gave it to me and disappeared into the crowd." "Lydia, look." She handed over the photograph, and Lydia's world tilted. It showed 2 little girls, maybe 6 and 7 years old, standing in front of a house Lydia didn't recognize. They were holding hands and smiling. One was clearly Elizabeth Cole. Lydia had seen enough pictures of her at the Cole farm to recognize that sweet face. The other girl looked startlingly familiar. Same eyes, same shape of face, same slight build. On the back, in faded ink, were 2 names, Elizabeth and Lily, 1870. Lily, Lydia. Could it be Jonas took the photograph, studying it carefully? "Lydia, how old were you when your parents died?" 14. They got fever in 76. Both went within a week of each other. Her mind was racing. "But before that, I don't remember much. Before I was 8 or 9. My mother said I'd been sick as a small child, that the fever had taken my early memories." "What if it wasn't fever?" Martha whispered. "What if there was something else? Some trauma that made you forget?" Lydia stared at the photograph, at this little girl who might have been her standing beside Elizabeth Cole like they were sisters. "But that would mean that you weren't just some random orphan Harriet took in," Jonas finished grimly. "That you were connected to Elizabeth somehow, maybe even her sister." Lydia breathed. Her real sister. The implications were staggering. If it was true, then Harriet hadn't just been tormenting a stranger. She'd been beating her own daughter, the daughter she'd somehow lost or given away, who'd been raised by other people who'd come back into her life without either of them knowing who the other truly was. "We need to investigate this," Jonas said. "Find out who gave Martha this picture, track down records, figure out the truth." But even as he spoke, Lydia knew the truth in her bones. She'd always felt strange around Harriet, like there was some connection she couldn't name. And now she understood it hadn't been just the connection of abuser and victim, it had been blood. She was Elizabeth's sister, Harriet's real daughter, the one who'd lived when Elizabeth died. And Harriet, drowning in guilt and grief, had punished her own child for the crime of surviving. The tragedy of it was almost too much to bear. Lydia sank onto the wagon seat, the photograph clutched in her trembling hands, and finally let herself cry, not for what had been, but for what might have been if they'd known. If Harriet had recognized her, if love had been stronger than grief. Martha held her while she sobbed, and Jonas drove them home in heavy silence. The truth had set Lydia free, but it had also revealed just how deep the tragedy ran. Two sisters separated somehow in childhood, one dead from a mother's neglect, the other beaten by that same mother who never knew she was harming her own flesh and blood. It was almost too cruel to be believed, almost. But as the wagon rolled toward the Hale ranch, toward the place that would now be her legal home, Lydia made a decision. Whatever the truth about her past, whatever blood connections existed or didn't, she would not let it define her future. She had been chosen by Jonas and Martha, chosen with full knowledge of her scars and her history and her pain. That choosing mattered more than any accident of birth. She was Lydia Grace Hale now, or would be once the adoption was final, and that was enough. That was everything. The photograph could wait. The questions could wait. The full truth, whatever it was, could wait. For now, she just wanted to go home. The investigation into the photograph took 3 months, and the answers came in pieces like a puzzle assembled by trembling hands in dim light. Jonas hired a lawyer to dig through old records, and what they found painted a picture even more heartbreaking than anyone had imagined. Lydia had indeed been born Lily Cole, the younger daughter of Harriet and Thomas Cole, when she was 4 years old during the same fever epidemic that would later claim Elizabeth Lily had fallen deathly ill. The doctors had given up hope, told Harriet and Thomas to prepare for the worst, but a traveling nurse named Grace Winters had refused to give up. She'd stayed by Lily's bedside for 6 days and nights, fighting the fever with every remedy she knew. And somehow, miraculously, the child had lived. But the fever had taken something. Lily's memories of her early life had been burned away, leaving her mind a blank slate before age 5. And Harriet, already fragile from losing her husband just months before, had looked at this child who didn't remember her own mother and made a terrible decision. She'd convinced herself that Lily had died, that this confused, memoryless child was a stranger wearing her daughter's face. In her fractured mind, keeping Lily would be a constant reminder of everything she'd lost. So when Grace Winters offered to take the child to raise her as her own, in a different county where Harriet would never have to see her, Harriet had agreed. She'd given away her own daughter and told Elizabeth, only 6 years old, that her baby sister had died. She'd held a funeral for a living child and tried to bury the truth along with the memory. Grace Winters had raised Lily as Lydia, giving her the middle name of her adoptive mother as a first name, never telling her about her real family. When Grace and her husband died of fever years later, Lydia had been placed with distant relatives who'd passed her along until she'd ended up back in Johnson County, back in the orbit of the mother who'd given her away. And Harriet, seeing this orphan girl who needed a home, had never recognized her own daughter. The fever had changed Lily's appearance just enough, thinned her face, darkened her hair slightly, and the years had done the rest. She'd taken in her own child and punished her for the crime of surviving, never knowing the terrible irony of what she was doing. When Jonas brought the evidence to the prison to show Harriet, Lydia went with him, She had to see her mother's face when she learned the truth. They met in a small room with barred windows, Harriet looking gaunt and gray in her prison uniform. When she saw the documents, the photographs, the testimony from old Dr. Sawyer, who'd been there through it all, her face went through a transformation that Lydia would never forget. Shock, denial, dawning horror, and finally a grief so profound it seemed to age her another decade in seconds. "No," Harriet whispered, her hands shaking as she looked at the photograph of her two daughters. "No, please, God, no." "I'm Lily," Lydia said quietly. "I was always Lily, your daughter. The one you gave away." Harriet's face crumpled. I thought you were the fever took your mind, and I was so broken, and I couldn't—" She broke off, her whole body shaking. "Dear God, what have I done? What have I done?" She reached for Lydia, but Lydia stepped back. Some wounds were too deep for a simple touch to heal. "I beat my own child," Harriet sobbed. "I looked at you every day and saw a stranger. I hated you for living when I thought both my daughters were dead. But you were mine. You were always mine, and You threw me away twice," Lydia said, and her voice was steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Once when I was 4, and again every day for 2 years. You had 2 chances to love me, and both times you chose cruelty instead." "I'm sorry, Lydia, Lily, I'm so sorry. If I could take it back, but you can't." Lydia wiped her eyes. "That's the thing about cruelty, Mrs. Cole. It can't be undone. You can apologize, you can grieve, you can wish things were different, but the scars remain. The damage is done." Harriet buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with sobs. "What do you want from me? Tell me how to make this right." Lydia looked at this broken woman who'd given her life and then spent years trying to break it, and she felt a strange mixture of pity and sorrow, and something that wasn't quite forgiveness but wasn't quite hatred either. "I don't want anything from you," she said finally. "I just wanted you to know the truth, to understand what you did, and to tell you that I'm going to be all right, not because of you, but in spite of you. I have a real family now, people who chose me, knowing exactly who I am, scars and all. That's more than you ever gave me." She turned to leave, but Harriet's voice stopped her. "Wait, please, there's something—" Harriet fumbled in her pocket and pulled out a small object, a locket, silver and tarnished. This was Elizabeth's. She wore it every day. Inside are pictures of both of you together. I want you to have it. Lydia took the locket with trembling fingers. Inside were 2 tiny portraits, Elizabeth and Lily, as small children, their faces pressed together, smiling. Sisters. She'd had a sister, and she couldn't even remember her. "She loved you so much," Harriet whispered. "After you died, she talked about you every day, said she could still feel you somehow, like you were still alive somewhere. I told her she was imagining things, that grief was making her see connections that weren't there, but she was right. She knew you were still alive, and I stole you from each other." The weight of that loss settled over Lydia like a shroud. She'd lost not just her childhood, not just her mother, but a sister who'd loved her, who'd sensed her presence, even when everyone said she was dead. "I forgave you in court," Lydia said, her voice thick with emotion, "and I meant it. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean I want you in my life. It just means I'm choosing not to carry your poison anymore." "I understand," Harriet said brokenly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, don't deserve your presence. But please, please know that if I could go back, if I could change everything." "But you can't," Lydia repeated. "None of us can. We can only move forward." She walked out of that prison with the locket clutched in her hand and Jonas's solid presence beside her, and she knew she'd never return. Whatever blood connection existed between her and Harriet, it had been severed by cruelty and could never be fully repaired. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Finally, Jonas spoke. "You know you don't have to take the Cole name back. You can stay Lydia Grace, or choose something entirely new, whatever feels right to you." Lydia considered this. Lily Cole had been given away, forgotten, erased. Lydia Grace had been beaten and broken. Maybe it was time for a new name, a new identity built on who she was choosing to become rather than who she'd been forced to be. Lydia Grace Hale, she said finally. When the adoption goes through, that's who I want to be. Jonas smiled and it reached his eyes. That's who you already are as far as I'm concerned. Papers are just making it official. Spring rolled into summer and the ranch came alive with color and growth. Jonas hired help to rebuild the barn, making it bigger and better than before. Martha planted a garden that exploded with vegetables and flowers, and Lydia found herself drawn to the rows of blooms, sunflowers, and black-eyed Susans and wild prairie roses. She thought about what Jonas had said about Sarah loving wildflowers, and she picked them by the armful to fill the house. It felt like honoring someone she'd never met, someone whose absence had made room for her presence. The adoption was finalized on a bright June morning, with half the town gathered at the courthouse to witness it. Judge Cartwright himself presided, and when he declared Lydia Grace officially and legally a Hale, the courtroom erupted in applause. Mrs. Henderson wept openly, and even Sheriff Miller had to wipe his eyes. Reverend Pierce offered a blessing, thanking God for taking broken things and making them whole again. That afternoon, Jonas hung a wooden sign over the ranch gate. He'd been working on it in secret for weeks, carving and sanding until the letters were perfect. Grace Haven. It read the words painted in white against dark wood. For what this place has become, he explained when Lydia asked. A haven for grace given and received. Seemed fitting. Lydia traced the letters with her fingers, feeling the smooth wood, the careful craftsmanship. This was her home now. Really, truly, permanently hers. But she had one more thing she needed to do. With Martha's help, she composed a letter to the prison, not to Harriet, but to the warden, making a request. She asked that Harriet be allowed to attend classes, to receive counseling, to have access to books, and the opportunity to heal her broken mind. She arranged for a small monthly sum from her inheritance Grace Winters had left her modest savings to be put toward Harriet's basic comforts. Mercy isn't about what someone deserves, she told Martha when asked why. It's about refusing to let their cruelty make us cruel too. I can't have a relationship with her, but I can make sure she has a chance at redemption even if I never see it. Martha hugged her tight. You're wiser than people twice your age, you know that. Lydia didn't feel wise. She just felt tired of hatred and ready for something better. As summer deepened, something unexpected began to happen. Orphans and struggling families started appearing at Grace Haven, sent by Reverend Pierce or Sheriff Miller, or just showing up on their own after hearing stories. A boy whose father drank away the farm, a girl whose stepmother couldn't feed all the children, 2 siblings whose parents had died in a wagon accident. Jonas and Martha took them in one by one, giving them work and food and safety. The ranch transformed into something more than a home. It became a refuge, a place where broken people could find healing. And Lydia, remembering what it felt like to be alone and afraid, took them under her wing. She taught them to read using the Bible Reverend Pierce had given her. She showed them how to care for the horses, how to plant seeds, and trust they'd grow. She told them stories of survival and hope, never hiding her own scars, but showing them what it looked like to move forward despite the pain. One afternoon, she found a small girl crying in the barn, a new arrival, maybe 8 years old, whose mother had died and whose father had abandoned her. Lydia sat beside her in the hay and spoke quietly. I know you're scared. I know you feel like the world is cruel and no one cares. But look around you. This place exists because people cared, because someone saw suffering and decided to do something about it. And now you're here and you're safe and you matter. The girl looked up with tear-swollen eyes. But what if I'm not good enough? What if I make mistakes? Lydia smiled and took her hand. Then you make mistakes. We all do. But here, mistakes aren't crimes. They're just part of learning. And you know what? Even when you mess up, Even when you fail, you're still worthy of love. That's the truth they should teach everyone, but most people have to learn it the hard way. She'd learned it the hard way herself, through beatings and fear, and finally, blessedly, through the patient kindness of people who saw her value even when she couldn't. By autumn, Grace Haven housed 7 children, besides Lydia, and the ranch had expanded to accommodate them. Jonas built additions to the house, creating dormitories and a schoolroom. Martha organized a schedule, making sure everyone had chores and lessons and time to just be children. And Lydia, at 17 now, found herself becoming something she'd never expected: a teacher, a guide, a living example that survival was possible, that healing was real, that love could overcome even the deepest wounds. One October evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold over the prairie, she stood on the porch watching the children play in the yard. Bear was in the middle of it all, his tail wagging as kids climbed over him. Jonas was teaching the older boys how to mend fence. Martha was hanging laundry while the younger girls helped, laughing at something one of them had said. This was family. Not perfect, not without struggles, but real and solid and built on choice rather than obligation. Reverend Pierce rode up, dismounting with a smile. Quite a sight, isn't it? A year ago, this was just a ranch. Now it's a sanctuary. A year ago, I was praying to disappear, Lydia said quietly. To just not exist anymore, because existing hurt too much. And now? She watched a little boy stumble and skin his knee. Jonas was there immediately, gentle and reassuring, checking the wound and making the child laugh even through tears. That's what love looked like, not perfection, but presence. Now I'm grateful I exist, Lydia said, because I get to be part of this, because I get to help other kids learn what I learned, that your past doesn't have to define your future, that cruelty doesn't have to be answered with cruelty, that even broken things can be beautiful. She fingered the locket around her neck, Elizabeth's locket, which she wore every day now. Inside were the portraits of 2 sisters who should have grown up together, who should have known each other, who'd been robbed of that chance by grief and fear and terrible choices. But Lydia had other sisters now, other brothers, a whole family built not on blood, but on something stronger: the deliberate choice to love and be loved, to heal and help others heal. I heard from the prison, Pierce said after a moment. Harriet's been attending the classes you arranged, reading everything she can get her hands on. The warden says she's like a different person, quiet, remorseful, actually trying to change. That's good, Lydia said, and meant it. Everyone deserves the chance to become better than they were, even her. You're remarkable. You know that most people who went through what you did would be eaten alive by bitterness. Lydia shook her head. I'm not remarkable. I'm just tired of pain. And I learned something important: hurt people, but healed people heal people. I'd rather be the latter. As Pierce rode away and the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonas came to stand beside Lydia on the porch. Together they watched the stars emerge one by one, pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. You ever regret it? Jonas asked quietly. Taking this path, staying here instead of trying to forget everything and start completely fresh somewhere else. Lydia thought about it. She could have run away, changed her name, built a life where no one knew about the scars or the trial or the terrible truth of her parentage. She could have tried to bury the past and pretend it never happened, but that would have meant letting Harriet's cruelty define her, letting fear and shame dictate her choices. It would have meant missing this: the children laughing in the yard, the home she'd found, the purpose she'd discovered in helping others find their own healing. No regrets, she said firmly. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. The next morning she woke early, as was her habit now, and walked out to the eastern pasture where the wildflowers grew thickest. She'd made it a ritual this morning, walk, a way of greeting each new day with gratitude instead of fear. The prairie stretched endlessly before her, grass rippling like water, the sky vast and full of promise. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain, the terror, the moments when she'd been certain she couldn't survive another day. And then the turning point when a stranger had ridden onto a farm with a lie about cattle and a heart full of determination to do what was right. She thought about Martha's patient kindness teaching her that mistakes didn't require punishment, about Reverend Pierce's moral courage speaking truth when everyone else stayed silent, about Mrs. Henderson and others who'd offered small kindnesses that added up to saving her life. And she thought about her own choice to forgive, to offer mercy she'd never received, to break the cycle of cruelty that could have so easily consumed her. Behind her, she heard footsteps and turned to find Jonas, approaching 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered her one, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "The children are talking about what they want to be when they grow up," Jonas said after a while. "You know what they all say." Lydia shook her head. "They want to be like you. Strong enough to survive, brave enough to forgive, kind enough to help others even after being hurt. You've become the example they're following." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm not that special, Jonas. I'm just doing what you and Martha taught me, choosing love over hate, grace over vengeance." "That's exactly what makes you special," he said gently. "Most people can't do that. Most people take their wounds and turn them into weapons. But you took yours and turned them into wisdom." As the sun fully rose, spilling golden light across the prairie, Lydia made a silent promise to Elizabeth, to the sister she'd never really known but carried in her heart. She promised to live fully, to love deeply, to take the second chance she'd been given and use it to create more second chances for others. She promised to be the kind of person who saw suffering and didn't look away, who heard a cry for help and answered, who knew the weight of cruelty and chose the lightness of compassion instead. Grace Haven would grow, she knew. More children would come, more broken souls seeking shelter, and she would be there ready to offer what had been offered to her: safety, kindness, the radical notion that every person deserved love simply for existing. The prairie wind picked up, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth, and Lydia Grace Hale turned her face to the sun. She was 17 years old, marked by scars but not defined by them, shaped by suffering but not destroyed by it. She had been whipped and broken, given away and reclaimed, beaten down and lifted up. She had learned that the hardest thing in the world wasn't surviving cruelty, it was choosing not to become cruel yourself. And she had made that choice over and over until it became who she was. Standing there in the morning light with her family behind her and endless possibility before her, Lydia understood something profound. The greatest victory over darkness isn't destroying it, but refusing to let it destroy the light within you. She had been Lily Cole, the daughter thrown away. She had been Lydia Grace, the orphan beaten down. Now she was Lydia Grace Hale, the survivor who became a healer, the wounded one who chose to bind others' wounds instead of inflicting new ones. And in that choice, that daily, deliberate choice to be better than her worst moments, kinder than her deepest wounds, she had found not just survival, but true freedom. The kind of freedom that no whip could take away, no cruelty could destroy, no past could diminish. She was whole. She was loved. She was home. And that she knew with absolute certainty was grace enough for any life.